This video was made possible by World of Tanks, the free-to-play multiplayer tactics game for PC. World of Tanks is where history meets action with high-impact combat gameplay and deep wartime strategy. Take charge of authentic vehicle models and feel like a real tank commander as you charge into massive historic battles. With over 550 tanks featuring varied play styles, how you conquer your opponent is up to you. Simple History viewers new to the World of Tanks experience can enter the code TANKMANIA to receive the Tier 5 Excelsior tank, 250,000 credits, and 7 days of premium access. You'll also be able to rent 3 Tier 6 tanks for 10 missions each for an extra boost to your combat prowess. Jump into the free online game World of Tanks using our link in the description. The U.S. M3 tank, the twin-gunned General, 1941 to 1957. In 1940, the war in Europe may have seemed distant and ever so far away to most Americans. Political and military leaders, however, no doubt recognized the threat posed by the Nazi regime, knowing it would only be a matter of time before the U.S. was forced to intervene in yet another bloody European conflict. What was probably most disconcerting to the U.S. government was how quickly the Germans had overwhelmed the combined forces of Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, all in just a matter of weeks. At the forefront of the Germans' rapid and seemingly unstoppable advance was a new breed of tank, the dreaded Panzer. Chiefly consisting of the impressive Panzer III and the early Panzer Mark IV tanks, divisions were also supported by large numbers of recently integrated Czech light tanks, particularly the highly effective LTVZ-38, which was designated the Panzer 38T by the Germans. The American military was quick to analyze the German success and came to 2 worrying conclusions. The first was that the tactic the Germans used was a very effective one, based around the concept of lightning war, or as it was to become better known as, blitzkrieg. This new approach called for swiftly coordinated tank columns, air support, and artillery, and resulted in a new highly mobile type of warfare, in which fortifications and trenches were rendered mostly ineffective. The second conclusion the Americans came to was that the German tank designs were far better than expected and easily outclassed what was currently being fielded by the American military. Although the U.S. had seen the potential in utilizing tanks as far back as the conclusion of the First World War, they had failed to adequately fund or develop this element during the interwar years. In fact, they only decided as late as the 1930s to start fully replacing their cavalry units with armored vehicles. As a result, when war erupted in Europe in 1939, the Americans could only field a very small number of tanks. Virtually all of them were of the M1 and M2 variety, both of which were light tanks effectively made obsolete by the caliber of the German opposition. The Americans had been developing the M2 tank into a medium-sized model. Figuring it would use many of the parts of the existing M2 light tank, the medium model would be very easy to produce and maintain. Sadly, it became apparent that this new tank would not be much of a match for the new breed of Panzer coming out of Germany. Though the upgraded M2 had an effective 37mm gun, its crew of 6 were overburdened with no less than 7 machine guns scattered around its frame, along with having to fulfill the demanding roles of commander, driver, gunner, loader, and radio operator, all this resulting in a rather chaotic and clumsily underperforming tank. So the Americans hurriedly started to develop a tank that would later become the legendary and highly successful M4 Sherman medium tank. In the meantime, however, both the Americans and the British desperately needed a stopgap tank to match the current generation of German tanks. In order to save time, it was decided that much of the failed M2 medium tank project would be utilized. But the major problem with this approach was that the turret ring of the M2 could not hold the larger 75mm main gun required to match that of the new Panzer IV. So an innovative solution was to use the World War I practice of installing the main gun on the side of the tank in a sponson mounting. This eliminated the need for a total redesign, but meant the gun had a very limited traverse and that the tank could not dig in a defensive position. A high-velocity 37mm turreted gun was also equipped on top of the crew compartment for all-around protection. When the British first saw the M3 prototype in the summer of 1940, they were very underwhelmed. They felt it reeked of compromise at every level, and at over 10 feet tall and 27 tons, it left an impression for all the wrong reasons. To make matters worse, for ease of production, the tank was of a riveted design. The flaw in this type of construction was represented by the danger of the rivets themselves, which, having absorbed the shockwaves of incoming fire on the armor's exterior, could pop loose and ricochet wildly about the interior compartment of the tank at incredible speeds, shredding the crew and vital equipment to pieces. Despite their misgivings, the British nevertheless felt forced to order large numbers of these tanks, as most of their armored brigades have been left behind during the evacuation of Dunkirk. The British variant of the M3 differed only slightly from the US Army version. Notably, the British model kept its radios situated in the turret rather than in the hull compartment. This made much more tactical sense, as the commander could communicate directly with other tanks while overseeing any engagement personally. The British model was nicknamed the Grant after the Union General Ulysses S. Grant from the American Civil War, whereas the US version was nicknamed the Lee after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee on the opposing side of the war. The M3 entered service in 1941 and proved reasonably successful. Nearly half of over 6,000 produced were assigned to the British forces. They were used extensively during the North African Campaign against the German Afrika Korps and the Italian Royal Army. When the North African Campaign concluded in 1943, their frontline service ceased in the West, but they were still used extensively against the Japanese in the Southeast Asia and Pacific theaters until the very end of the war in 1945. Despite its flaws, even the Germans came to hold the M3 in quite high regard, recognizing it as a deadly and well-armed adversary. The Japanese were similarly forced to respect the M3, unable to field anything to match it in terms of firepower and armored protection. The Australian and Indian Army also used them in large numbers during the war. It acquired the fanciful nickname of the Iron Cathedral due to its impressive dimensions. Interestingly, around 1,400 were supplied to the Soviet Union to help them replenish their ranks after the horrendous casualties suffered at the hands of the Germans during Operation Barbarossa. It's estimated that around 400 M3 tanks were lost during delivery, as Allied shipping vessels fell victim to the threat of Germany's U-boat campaign and aerial attacks before they could arrive at their destination. At the end of the war, the tank was withdrawn from military service, with most being scrapped. In post-war Australia, the Army sold off many of theirs to be used as tractors on farms. A number were, however, kept and converted into self-propelled howitzers named Urambas. This was done by removing all their weaponry and centrally mounting a 25-pound gun in the center of an open-topped hull. Its name was derived from the Aboriginal instrument used for throwing spears, and these vehicles were relatively successful and were well liked by their crew. They were finally phased out of service in 1957, thus ending the military career of these twin gun generals.